The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks of Miners Creek, but Sarah Mitchell barely noticed. She stood at the window of her father's mercantile, watching the town come alive with its usual rhythm, feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 23 with auburn hair pinned severely back, green eyes that had forgotten how to sparkle, and a mouth that had learned to hold its silence. Behind her, the shop bell chimed with false cheerfulness as the first customers of the day pushed through the door, and she turned to greet them with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. The autumn of 1879 had arrived with a crispness that promised early winter, and with it came the weight of expectations Sarah could no longer escape. For 3 years, since her father's stroke had left him diminished and dependent, she had managed the mercantile alone, keeping the accounts, ordering stock, negotiating with suppliers who thought a woman's word worth half a man's promise. She had kept the business alive through sheer determination, her hands growing rough from unpacking crates, her back aching from lifting flour sacks, her mind sharp from calculating profit margins that grew thinner each season. The townspeople praised her competence while pitying her unmarried state, as if the two were somehow connected, as if a woman's worth could only be measured in her ability to secure a husband rather than save a failing business. But Miners Creek was not a town that allowed its women much independence, especially not women who stood as visible reminders of what happened when the natural order was disrupted. The church ladies whispered over their quilting, the men spoke in grave tones at the saloon, and even the children seemed to absorb the collective judgment that hung in the air like smoke from the forge. Sarah Mitchell had refused 2 proposals in the past year, both from respectable men who would have lifted the burden from her thin shoulders, and the town had decided that her refusal was not a right but a rebellion that needed correction. Charles Thornton made his intentions known on a Tuesday morning in late September, walking into the mercantile with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything of value. He was the town's banker, a position that carried weight in a community where credit meant survival and foreclosure meant ruin. At 38, he was considered a prime catch despite the coldness in his pale blue eyes and the thin line of his mouth that suggested smiles were a currency he rarely spent. He wore his prosperity like armor, his suit perfectly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his gold watch chain glinting in the lamplight like a promise or a threat. Sarah had been arranging bolts of fabric when he entered, her fingers smoothing calico and cotton with the automatic care of someone who understood that presentation mattered, that even the smallest details could mean the difference between a sale and a missed opportunity. She looked up as his shadow fell across the counter, her heart already sinking with the certainty of what was coming, her mind already calculating the cost of whatever words would follow. "Miss Mitchell," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I wonder if you might spare me a moment of your time for a private conversation." She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him that she had no time for private conversations, that the morning inventory needed completing and Mrs. Henderson would be arriving soon to collect her order of buttons and thread. But the look in his eyes told her that refusal was not an option, that this conversation would happen now or later, in private or before witnesses, but it would happen regardless of her wishes. She set down the fabric, wiped her hands on her apron, and nodded toward the small office at the back of the store where her father kept his ledgers and his dreams of a prosperity that never quite materialized. The office smelled of old paper and lamp oil, the walls lined with shelves holding accounting books that documented years of careful transactions and narrow margins. Charles closed the door behind them with a soft click that sounded to Sarah like a cell door closing, trapping her in a space too small for the conversation she knew was coming. He did not waste time with pleasantries or false sentiment, which she might have respected under different circumstances. "I'll be direct," he said, standing too close, invading the space she tried to maintain around herself like a wall against the world. "Your father's debts have reached a critical point. The mortgage on this building, the outstanding credit accounts, the personal loans he took to cover shortfalls in inventory. The total sum exceeds $3,000. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, though she had suspected the situation was dire. Her father had hidden the worst of it from her, signing papers when his hand could barely hold a pen, making promises when his mind was clouded with laudanum and desperation. She had seen the worry in his eyes during his lucid moments, but he had waved away her questions, telling her not to trouble herself with matters beyond her understanding, as if keeping her ignorant somehow protected her from the consequences of his failures. "I've been patient," Charles continued, his voice measured and cold as January wind. "More patient than most creditors would be, given the circumstances. But patience has its limits, and the bank has obligations to its other depositors. I cannot continue to extend grace indefinitely." "How long do we have?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt in her core, the fear that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "That depends entirely on you." The words hung between them like a noose waiting for a neck, and Sarah understood with perfect clarity what he was offering, what he was demanding. She had heard stories of such arrangements in other towns, other situations where desperation met opportunity and women became commodities to be traded for financial security. She had never imagined she would find herself in such a position, never thought her life would narrow to such a terrible choice. "I am prepared to forgive the debts entirely," Charles said, stepping even closer, his breath warm against her cheek, his presence suffocating. "The mortgage, the credit accounts, the personal loans, all of it erased as if it never existed. Your father could live out his remaining days in comfort rather than shame. You would have security, position, respect. All I ask in return is your hand in marriage." Sarah turned away, unable to bear the smugness in his expression, the certainty that she would accept because what choice did she have, really? A woman alone, with a dependent father and failing business, in a town where respectability meant everything and poverty meant slow starvation of body and spirit both. She looked at the ledgers on the shelves, at her father's careful handwriting documenting years of honest work and honest failure, and she wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all, at the way the world arranged itself to trap women in cages built of duty and desperation. "I need time to think," she managed to say, though they both knew thinking would not change the fundamental mathematics of her situation. "Of course," Charles replied with false generosity. "Take a week. But understand that if your answer is no, I will have no choice but to proceed with foreclosure. The law is quite clear on such matters, and I have my professional responsibilities to consider." He left then, placing his hat back on his head with the satisfied gesture of a man who had played his cards well and knew the game was already won. Sarah stood alone in the small office, listening to the bell chime his departure, feeling the walls close in around her like a coffin being nailed shut. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years from a fever that swept through the town, taking the weak and leaving the strong to struggle on. Her mother had married for love, or so she had told Sarah in those final fever-bright days, her hand clutching her daughter's with desperate intensity. She had married a man who made her laugh, who saw her as more than a convenience or a solution to a problem, who valued her thoughts and dreams even when the world told him they were foolish and impractical. Sarah had promised herself she would do the same, would wait for a man who saw her truly, who wanted her for herself rather than for what she could provide or represent. But promises made to oneself in youth often crumbled under the weight of adult realities, and she was learning that love was a luxury afforded only to those who could survive without it. The week passed with the speed of an execution countdown, each day bringing her closer to a decision she did not want to make but could not avoid. Her father, in his more lucid moments, seemed to sense something was wrong, patting her hand with his trembling fingers and telling her in his slurred speech that she was a good daughter, the best daughter a man could want, and she should not worry so much about things beyond her control. She wanted to tell him everything, wanted to lay the burden at his feet and let him share the weight of this impossible choice, but his health was too fragile, his spirit too broken, and she could not add to his suffering. The town, meanwhile, seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting to see if Sarah Mitchell would finally bow to inevitability and accept the offer that everyone agreed was far more than she deserved. The church ladies spoke of it as God's provision, Charles Thornton's willingness to overlook her advanced age and difficult temperament in favor of Christian charity. The men spoke of it as sound business sense, consolidating assets and resolving debts in a manner that benefited all parties. No one asked Sarah what she wanted, what she dreamed of, what she felt when she imagined standing at an altar and promising forever to a man whose touch made her skin crawl. On the 5th day of her week of contemplation, a stranger rode into town on a horse that had seen better days, leading a pack mule loaded with carpenter's tools and the kind of worn equipment that spoke of hard use and harder times. He dismounted in front of the mercantile with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, tying his horse to the rail with practiced efficiency before stepping through the door with a polite touch to his hat brim. Sarah looked up from the account books she had been pretending to study, her mind too scattered to make sense of the numbers that usually provided such clarity and comfort. The stranger was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a few days' worth of beard shadowing a jaw that suggested both strength and gentleness. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots scuffed and repaired, his hands calloused and scarred in the way of a man who worked with them for his living. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown and warm, holding a kindness that seemed out of place in her current world of cold transactions and colder bargains. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a hint of somewhere else, somewhere south perhaps, where the sun was warmer and life moved at a different pace. "I'm looking for supplies and maybe some information about work in the area. Name's Daniel Cooper, and I'm a carpenter by trade, looking to settle somewhere for the winter before pushing on come spring." Sarah found herself responding to his easy manner, to the lack of presumption in his tone, to the way he looked at her as if she were a person rather than a problem to be solved. "We have supplies," she said, gesturing to the shelves stocked with everything from nails to flour to patent medicines. "As for work, you might check with the church. They've been talking about repairs to the steeple since spring, and the Reverend's been looking for someone skilled enough to handle the job." Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the store with the assessing gaze of someone who understood inventory and organization, who could read the health of a business in the way goods were displayed and maintained. "You run a good establishment," he said, and there was no flattery in his tone, just honest observation. "Clean, well organized, fair prices from what I can see. That's rarer than it should be." The compliment warmed something in Sarah that had been cold for too long, some part of her that still craved recognition for her competence, her dedication, her years of silent labor that the town took for granted. "Thank you," she said simply, not trusting herself to say more, not wanting to reveal how much those few words meant to her. He purchased basic supplies, counting out his coins with the careful precision of a man who knew the exact weight of his resources and could not afford waste or extravagance. As she wrapped his purchases in brown paper and twine, she found herself studying his hands, noting the old scars across his knuckles, the thick calluses on his palms, the steady sureness of his movements. These were hands that built things, that created rather than destroyed, that knew the satisfaction of honest work completed with skill and care. "You got family helping you run this place?" Daniel asked as he collected his parcels, the question casual but something in his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "My father," Sarah replied, the words catching slightly in her throat. "He's not well. Most of the day-to-day operations fall to me now." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a heavy load for one person. This town's lucky to have someone willing to carry it." He left then, touching his hat brim again in farewell, and Sarah watched through the window as he led his horse toward the church, his stride purposeful but unhurried, a man comfortable with his own pace and direction. She realized she was smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes and lightened something in her chest, and the realization startled her. When had she last smiled genuinely at anything? When had she last felt anything besides resignation and duty and the grinding weight of impossible expectations? The smile faded as reality reasserted itself. In 2 days, Charles Thornton would return for her answer, and smiling at strangers would not change the fundamental arithmetic of her situation. She had no money to pay the debts, no way to save the mercantile without accepting his offer, no option that did not end in either marriage to a man she could not love or poverty that would destroy what remained of her father's dignity and her own carefully constructed life. That evening, as she helped her father eat his supper with the patience of someone who had learned that rushing only made things worse, she tried to find the words to tell him about Charles's proposal, about the choice she faced, about the future that seemed to be rushing toward her like a runaway wagon with no brake and no clear path forward. But her father's eyes were cloudy with medication and confusion, his attention wandering between bites, and she could not bring herself to burden him with knowledge he could not change. Instead, she read to him from the newspaper, the words washing over both of them like a lullaby, familiar and meaningless, a ritual of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly surreal. When he finally dozed off in his chair by the fire, his breathing shallow but steady, she covered him with a quilt her mother had made years ago, the stitches still tight and true, a reminder of a time when this house had held laughter and hope and the kind of love that made hardship bearable. Sarah climbed the stairs to her small bedroom under the eaves, the space she had occupied since childhood, and stood at the window looking out over the sleeping town. Lamplight glowed in a few windows, smoke curled from chimneys against the darkening sky, and somewhere a dog barked with the enthusiasm of an animal that had never learned disappointment or despair. The world outside her window seemed peaceful, ordinary, completely indifferent to the small tragedy of one woman's narrowing choices and fading dreams. She thought of her mother's words, spoken in fever and desperation, about marrying for love and the importance of choosing a man who saw her soul as clearly as her face. She thought of her own younger self, full of romantic notions and fierce independence, certain that she would never settle for anything less than a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. She thought of all the ways life had worn those certainties down to nothing, leaving only the hard choices and harder consequences of survival in a world that offered women so few options beyond marriage or marginalization. And she thought, unexpectedly, of Daniel Cooper's kind brown eyes and the way he had looked at her store with appreciation rather than judgment, had spoken to her with respect rather than condescension, had seemed comfortable with himself in a way that suggested he had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. It was foolish to let a stranger's kindness influence her thinking, foolish to imagine that one brief encounter could matter in the face of debts and duties and the crushing weight of expectation. But sometimes foolishness was the only rebellion left to those who had exhausted all reasonable options. The next day brought rain, a cold, steady downpour that turned the streets to mud and kept most customers away from the mercantile. Sarah used the quiet hours to work through inventory, counting and recounting stock with the methodical focus of someone seeking escape in numbers and routine. Her father dozed in his chair, occasionally stirring to ask where he was or why the shop was so empty, his confusion deepening as his body weakened and his mind retreated further into the fog of illness and age. She was wrestling with a crate of canned goods that had arrived on the morning freight when the door opened, bringing a gust of cold wind and rain and Daniel Cooper shaking water from his hat. He looked apologetic for dripping on her clean floors, but his smile was warm and his presence somehow filled the empty spaces of the store with something that felt oddly like possibility. "Sorry to bother you in this weather," he said, pulling off his soaked jacket. "Reverend hired me for the church repairs, and I need some additional supplies. Seems the damage is worse than he thought, and the job's going to take longer than expected." Sarah felt something lift in her chest, some weight she had not known she was carrying suddenly lighter at the knowledge that he would be staying longer, that she would see him again, that the town of Miners Creek would hold at least one person who looked at her with kindness rather than calculation. She helped him select what he needed, their hands occasionally brushing as they moved around the store, and each accidental touch sent warmth through her cold fingers like touching sunlight after a long winter. "You look troubled," Daniel said suddenly, his directness catching her off guard. "I don't mean to presume, but sometimes a stranger's ear is easier than a friend's judgment if you need to talk about what's weighing on you." Sarah found herself telling him everything, the words spilling out in a rush that surprised her with its intensity and honesty. She told him about her father's debts, about Charles Thornton's proposal, about the week's deadline and the impossible choice between her own desires and her father's welfare. She told him about feeling trapped, about the town's expectations, about the way everyone seemed to believe she should be grateful for an offer that made her feel like livestock being purchased at market. She had not meant to share so much, had not planned to burden a stranger with her troubles, but something about his steady presence and quiet attention made the words flow freely, as if she had been waiting years for someone who would simply listen without immediately offering solutions or judgment. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful and sympathetic, and when she finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Seems to me," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that a marriage built on debt and duty is no marriage at all. It's a business transaction dressed up in wedding clothes, and you deserve better than that. Any woman does." "Deserving and having are different things," Sarah replied, the bitterness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to maintain composure. "In this world, women get what circumstance allows, not what fairness would grant." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But circumstance can change. Options can appear where none seem to exist. I learned that lesson the hard way, more than once." There was something in his tone that suggested experience with hard lessons, with changed circumstances and discovered options. Sarah wanted to ask what his story was, what had brought him to her town at precisely this moment, whether he believed in providence or simply coincidence. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by a lifetime of learning not to ask too many questions, not to presume too much familiarity, not to hope for more than the bare minimum that life seemed willing to provide. He left with his supplies, promising to return in a few days for additional materials, and Sarah watched him disappear into the rain with a strange sensation that something significant had just occurred, though she could not name what or why. She felt less alone somehow, less trapped in the narrow corridor of her choices, even though nothing practical had changed and her deadline still approached with inexorable certainty. That night, she lay in bed listening to rain drum against the roof and wind rattle the windows, her mind turning over Daniel's words about deserving better, about circumstances changing, about options appearing where none seemed to exist. She thought about her mother's deathbed advice, about marrying for love rather than necessity, about choosing a man who saw her soul as clearly as her face. And she thought about Charles Thornton's cold eyes and Daniel Cooper's warm ones, about the difference between obligation and choice, between surrender and rebellion, between safety and the kind of freedom that terrified even as it tempted. Sleep came late and brought restless dreams of being chased through endless corridors with doors that opened onto more corridors, of searching for something precious she had lost but could not name, of standing at crossroads trying to read signs in languages she did not understand. She woke before dawn feeling exhausted rather than rested, her body aching as if she had truly been running all night, her mind no clearer about what decision she would make when Charles returned tomorrow for her answer. The final day of her week of contemplation arrived with cruel sunshine, the storm having passed in the night to leave everything washed clean and sparkling with false promise. Sarah dressed with extra care, knowing this day would be remembered, knowing that whatever choice she made would alter the course of her life in ways she could not fully predict or control. She chose her mother's cameo brooch, the small piece of jewelry that connected her to a time when love had seemed possible and the future had stretched out with infinite potential. Charles arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, his punctuality as reliable as his cold ambition, his expression confident as he entered the store with the bearing of a man expecting good news. Sarah met him in the office, the same cramped space where he had presented his offer a week ago, and she felt the walls closing in again even as she steeled herself for what needed to be said. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my proposal," Charles said, not bothering with pleasantries or small talk, his manner businesslike and efficient. "I've brought the papers that will need signing, the documents that will transfer the debts and establish our engagement formally." Sarah looked at the papers he laid on the desk, at the neat legal language that would transform her life into a contract, that would trade her freedom for her father's security, that would close the door on every dream she had ever harbored about love and partnership and being seen as more than a solution to someone else's problem. She thought about saying yes, about taking the safe path, about choosing security over uncertainty and duty over desire. And then she thought about Daniel Cooper's warm brown eyes and his words about deserving better, about circumstances changing, about options appearing where none seemed to exist. She thought about her mother's dying wish that she marry for love. She thought about who she would become if she said yes to this man, how she would have to silence every part of herself that still hoped for something more, something real, something that made her heart race with joy rather than dread. "No," she said, the word emerging clear and strong despite the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. "I cannot marry you, Mr. Thornton. I will not marry you." The silence that followed was arctic, Charles's face transforming from confidence to disbelief to cold fury in the space of seconds. "You're refusing me?" he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "After everything I've offered, after the generosity I've shown, you dare to refuse me?" "I'm grateful for your offer," Sarah said, forcing herself to meet his eyes even as fear clutched at her throat. "But I cannot accept a marriage without affection, without respect, without the possibility of genuine partnership. I will find another way to address my father's debts." "There is no other way," Charles hissed, leaning across the desk with menace in every line of his body. "You have nothing, you are nothing without what I offer. This mercantile will be mine by week's end. Your father will die in shame and poverty, and you will have no one to blame but your own foolish pride." He gathered his papers with violent efficiency and stormed from the office, from the store, his departure marked by the angry slam of the door and the startled looks of the few customers who had witnessed his fury. Sarah stood frozen in the office, her hands gripping the edge of the desk to keep herself upright, her breathing shallow and rapid as the full weight of what she had done crashed over her like a wave intent on drowning. She had refused him. She had chosen poverty and uncertainty over security and misery. She had gambled everything on the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, another option would present itself before the foreclosure became final and her father's shame became complete. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever done, and also somehow the most liberating, as if in saying no to what everyone expected she had finally said yes to some essential part of herself that had been suffocating under the weight of duty and resignation. The news of Sarah's refusal spread through Miners Creek with the speed of wildfire in drought season, each telling embellished with judgment and speculation about her sanity, her pride, her foolish disregard for her father's welfare and her own survival. By afternoon, the few customers who had been trickling in stopped coming altogether, as if association with her impending ruin might prove contagious. The church ladies who had once praised her devotion now whispered about her stubborn nature and inflated sense of self-worth. The men who had tipped their hats in passing now looked away when she ventured onto the street, embarrassed by her presence or perhaps by their own relief that their daughters had shown more sense in accepting whatever marriage offers came their way. Sarah spent the remainder of that terrible day mechanically performing the routines that had structured her life for 3 years, dusting shelves that were already clean, reorganizing stock that was already perfectly arranged, finding comfort in the familiar tasks even as she knew each action might be among her last in this place that had been both prison and sanctuary. Her father dozed through most of the afternoon, oblivious to the storm his daughter had unleashed, occasionally waking to ask for water or to wonder aloud about when her mother would be home from visiting the neighbors, his mind retreating further into a past that was kinder than the present. As evening shadows lengthened across the floor, Sarah was beginning to close up shop when Daniel Cooper appeared in the doorway, his presence so unexpected that she nearly dropped the cash box she was carrying to the office. He looked concerned, his hat in his hands, his expression grave with a kind of sympathy that suggested he had heard the news and understood its implications far better than most of the townspeople who saw only scandal and foolishness where he seemed to recognize courage. "I heard what happened," he said without preamble, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with gentle care. "The whole town's talking about it, and most of what they're saying isn't kind or fair." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself all day, and she blinked them back fiercely because crying would accomplish nothing except to prove what everyone already believed about women and their emotional instability. "I made my choice," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll live with the consequences, whatever they may be." "That's not what I came to say," Daniel replied, moving closer but maintaining a respectful distance, his body language careful and unthreatening. "I came to tell you that you're not alone in this, that there might be options you haven't considered, that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse the easy path even when everyone else thinks them foolish for it." "Easy?" Sarah laughed, the sound bitter and raw. There was nothing easy about Charles Thornton's offer except the ease with which it would have destroyed everything I am. But bravery doesn't pay debts, Mr. Cooper, and it won't save my father from the shame of foreclosure or me from the reality of having nowhere to go and no way to earn a living in a town that's already decided I'm beyond redemption." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful as he seemed to weigh his next words with the care of a man who understood that words could change lives as surely as actions. "What if there was another way?" he said finally. "What if you could keep the mercantile, pay off the debts, maintain your independence, all without having to marry a man you can't stomach?" Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to hope that such a solution existed, but 3 years of managing impossible situations had taught her that hope was often just another word for self-deception. "There is no such way," she said flatly. "I've examined every possibility, considered every option. The mathematics are simple and brutal. I owe more than I can possibly earn, and without capital or credit I cannot even attempt to dig myself out of this hole." "What if you had a partner?" Daniel asked, and something in his tone made Sarah's heart beat faster, made her look at him with new attention and cautious wonder. "Someone who could invest in the business, someone with skills that could expand what you offer, someone who could share the work and the risk and the rewards?" "I don't understand," Sarah said, though part of her was beginning to, though the possibility he was suggesting seemed too improbable, too convenient, too much like the kind of providence that showed up in stories but rarely in real life. Daniel took a breath, seeming to gather his courage in a way that made him suddenly vulnerable, suddenly real in a manner that transcended his easy manner and quiet confidence. "I have money saved," he said. "Not a fortune, but enough to make a significant payment on your father's debts, enough to buy time and breathing room. I have skills as a carpenter and builder that this town needs, skills that could be housed in a workshop attached to your mercantile, creating a business partnership that benefits both of us. And I have no ties to this place, no history that would complicate matters, no expectations beyond honest work and fair dealing." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was offering, trying to understand why a stranger would propose such a thing, trying to find the catch or the angle or the hidden cost that experience had taught her always existed in arrangements that seemed too generous to be true. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you risk your savings on a failing business and a woman you barely know?" "Because I recognize something in you that I've carried in myself for a long time," Daniel said, his honesty almost painful in its directness. "The weight of trying to do everything alone, the burden of believing you have to be strong enough to weather every storm without help or hope or the simple human comfort of knowing someone else shares your struggles. I've been where you are, Miss Mitchell, maybe not in the exact circumstances, but in the feeling of it, the isolation and the fear and the desperate certainty that asking for help is somehow weakness rather than wisdom." He paused, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced since her mother's death, seen and understood and valued for something beyond her usefulness or her compliance. "I came to Miners Creek looking for a place to settle for the winter," he continued. "I found a woman worth knowing, a business worth saving, and a situation where my resources could make a real difference. Maybe that's providence, maybe it's just coincidence, but either way it seems foolish not to at least explore the possibility." Sarah felt something pop open in her chest, some hard shell of self-protection that had been building for years, and with it came a flood of emotion she could not name or control. She wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab this lifeline with both hands and not question the miracle of its appearance. But caution warred with hope, practicality with desperate need, and she forced herself to think through the implications rather than simply react to the relief his offer provided. "A business partnership," she said slowly, testing the words, examining them for hidden meanings or dangerous assumptions. "You would invest money, provide carpentry services, share in the work and the profits. But what about the town? What about the gossip and the judgment that would follow such an arrangement?" Daniel smiled, and there was something sad in the expression, something that spoke of his own experience with gossip and judgment and the cruelty of communities that valued conformity over compassion. "The town is already talking," he said. "Already judging. You can live your life trying to meet expectations that shift like sand and satisfy critics who will never be satisfied, or you can build something true and solid and let the talkers talk themselves hoarse while you're too busy thriving to care what they think. It was the most radical thing Sarah had heard in her entire life, the idea that she could simply not care about the collective opinion of Miners Creek, that she could choose her own path regardless of the whispers and the sidelong glances and the careful social exclusion that awaited those who stepped outside the accepted boundaries. Part of her wanted to reject such thinking as dangerous and naive, but another part, the part that had refused Charles Thornton and gambled everything on the slim hope of another option, recognized truth in Daniel's words even if accepting that truth required more courage than she was certain she possessed. "I need time to think," she said, though even as she spoke she could feel herself leaning toward acceptance, toward the possibility he offered, toward the kind of partnership that might actually work if both parties entered it with honesty and goodwill. "This is not a small decision, and I need to consider all the implications, talk to my father if he has a lucid moment, understand exactly what you're proposing and what expectations come with it." "Of course," Daniel agreed. "Take the time you need. But don't take too long. Thornton will move quickly now that you've refused him, and spite can be a powerful motivator for men who are used to getting what they want." He left then, his departure marked by a touch to his hat brim and a look of such warm understanding that Sarah felt tears threaten again, tears she would not shed until she was safely alone in her room where no one could see and judge the depth of her relief and confusion and tentative, terrifying hope. She finished closing the store in a daze, her mind spinning through possibilities and problems, through the mathematics of shared investment and the logistics of combining businesses, through the social implications and the practical challenges and the simple human question of whether she could trust a stranger who seemed too good to be true. That night, her father had one of his rare lucid periods, his eyes clearing as she helped him to bed, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength as if he sensed something significant was happening even if he could not quite grasp the details. "Your mother," he said, his speech slow but clear, "would want you to be happy, not just safe. She told me that, near the end. Said she'd rather see you poor and joyful than prosperous and miserable. I didn't understand what she meant then, but I think I do now." Sarah felt the tears she had been holding back all day finally break free, streaming down her face as she clutched her father's hand and felt the weight of his blessing even though she had not yet explained what decision she was facing. "I refused Charles Thornton," she confessed, the words rushing out in a tumble of relief and fear. "I know I should have accepted. I know it was foolish and prideful and probably means we'll lose everything, but I couldn't do it, Papa. I couldn't marry a man who made me feel like property being acquired rather than a person being cherished." Her father nodded slowly, his eyes bright with understanding and something that might have been pride. "Good girl," he whispered. "My good, brave girl. Your mother would be proud, and so am I. We'll find a way through this. We always have, haven't we?" But even as he spoke, his eyes were clouding again, his grip loosening as the medication pulled him back into comfortable confusion, and Sarah was left alone with the knowledge that his blessing was real but his ability to help was gone, that whatever happened next would be her decision and her responsibility and her triumph or failure to bear. She spent a sleepless night weighing every aspect of Daniel's proposal, examining it from every angle for hidden costs or unreasonable expectations. A business partnership made sense on paper, the combination of her mercantile knowledge and his carpentry skills creating something more valuable than either could achieve alone. The money he offered would not erase her father's debts entirely, but would buy time and demonstrate good faith to creditors, might even convince some of them to extend additional grace given the changed circumstances. The workshop he proposed could occupy the unused space behind the mercantile, the area her father had always meant to develop but never found the resources or energy to improve. But partnerships required trust, and trust was not something Sarah gave easily, not after years of watching her father's trust exploited by suppliers who shipped inferior goods and customers who conveniently forgot their outstanding accounts. Daniel Cooper was a stranger, appearing at the exact moment she needed help, offering solutions that seemed almost too perfectly aligned with her problems. Was he genuine, or was this simply another form of exploitation, a longer game played by a more patient predator who recognized that her desperation made her vulnerable to seemingly generous offers? Yet something in her heart, that part of herself she had learned to distrust as impractical and naive, insisted that Daniel's offer was real, that his kindness was genuine, that not every man who helped a woman in trouble expected payment in forms beyond the purely financial. She thought of his warm brown eyes and the way he had listened without judgment, had offered assistance without condescension, had spoken of partnership rather than rescue as if he recognized that she was capable and strong rather than helpless and weak. By morning, Sarah had made her decision, though she felt it less as a choice than as an inevitability, as if some deeper part of herself had always known what she would do and her conscious mind was simply catching up to what her heart had already determined. She would accept Daniel's partnership offer, would gamble on his integrity and her own judgment, would choose the uncertain possibility of building something new over the certain misery of marrying Charles Thornton or the equally certain destruction of refusing him without alternative. She found Daniel at the church, high on scaffolding repairing the steeple with the confident efficiency of a man who knew his trade and took pride in his work. He saw her approaching and climbed down immediately, reading something in her expression that told him why she had come even before she spoke. They walked to a quiet spot behind the church where no one could overhear, where the morning sun filtered through pine trees and cast dappled shadows across ground still damp from the recent rain. "I accept your offer," Sarah said without preamble, because prolonging the moment would not change her decision or make it easier to speak. "A business partnership, sharing investment and labor and profits according to terms we'll need to negotiate in detail. But I have conditions, things that must be understood and agreed to before we proceed." "Of course," Daniel said, his expression serious but pleased, as if her acceptance mattered more than simple business sense would dictate. "Tell me what you need." Sarah had spent part of her sleepless night preparing this list, thinking through what protections she required, what boundaries needed establishing, what terms would make this partnership viable rather than simply trading one form of dependence for another. "First, my authority over the mercantile operations must be recognized and respected. I've been running that business for 3 years, and I won't be reduced to a figurehead while someone else makes decisions about inventory and pricing and customer relations." "Agreed," Daniel said immediately. "I know nothing about running a mercantile, and I have no desire to learn. That's your domain, and I respect your expertise." "Second," Sarah continued, gaining confidence from his ready acceptance, "the financial arrangements must be documented properly, with clear accounting of all investments, profits, and distributions. I won't have anyone accusing me of taking advantage or mismanaging funds, and I need protection in case this partnership doesn't work as we hope." "Fair and wise," Daniel agreed. "We'll draw up proper papers, have them witnessed and filed legally. Everything transparent and above board." "Third," Sarah said, her voice dropping slightly as she approached the most delicate condition, "I need your word as a gentleman that this partnership is purely business, that you expect nothing beyond professional cooperation and shared commercial success, that you understand I am not offering anything of a personal nature in exchange for your investment and assistance." Daniel met her eyes steadily, and she saw understanding in his gaze along with something that might have been disappointment or perhaps just acceptance of necessary boundaries. "You have my word," he said solemnly. "I would never presume to expect personal favors in exchange for business arrangements. If anything more than partnership ever develops between us, it will be because we both want it, freely chosen without obligation or pressure, or it won't happen at all." Relief flooded through Sarah, along with something else she did not want to examine too closely, something that felt oddly like disappointment even though his answer was exactly what she had hoped to hear. "Then we have an agreement," she said, extending her hand in the formal gesture of business dealings, feeling her heart pound as his larger, calloused hand closed around hers with warm strength and gentle respect. They spent the next several days working out details, drawing up papers with the help of the town's lawyer who looked skeptical but could find no legal reason to refuse drafting the partnership agreement they requested. Word spread quickly through Miners Creek that Sarah Mitchell had found a way to address her debts without marrying Charles Thornton, and the reaction was mixed at best. Some admired her resourcefulness, Others saw it as further evidence of her unwillingness to accept proper female roles, and still others whispered darkly about the impropriety of a business partnership between an unmarried woman and a bachelor carpenter, suggesting that such arrangements were simply prostitution dressed in legal language. Charles Thornton's rage was cold and calculated rather than hot and explosive. He called in his notes immediately, demanding full payment within 30 days rather than allowing the usual grace period, and made it clear to other creditors that anyone extending additional mercy to Sarah Mitchell would find their own credit at his bank suddenly re-evaluated. It was economic warfare waged with the weapons of a man who controlled access to capital in a small town, and it might have worked except that Daniel's investment, combined with Sarah's careful management, allowed them to meet the most pressing obligations while negotiating reasonable terms with the remaining creditors who were less beholden to Thornton's influence. The workshop took shape in the space behind the mercantile, Daniel working long hours to convert the unused area into a proper carpentry shop while still completing his church repairs and taking on additional jobs around town. Sarah watched him work when she could spare moments from her own duties, noting the care he took with each joint and measurement, the way he spoke gently to wood as if coaxing it into its proper form rather than forcing it into submission, the satisfaction that lit his face when a difficult piece came together exactly as planned. They fell into patterns of cooperation that surprised them both with their ease and efficiency, Daniel building custom shelving and display cases that showed merchandise to better advantage, Sarah keeping accounts and managing orders with the precision that had always been her strength but now had additional resources to support her efforts. They shared meals sometimes, simple suppers eaten in the mercantile's small kitchen after closing, conversation flowing easily about business matters and gradually expanding to include stories about their pasts, their hopes, their understanding of what made life worth living beyond mere survival. Sarah learned that Daniel had grown up in Tennessee, the son of a furniture maker who had taught him craftsmanship along with integrity, that he had lost his young wife to cholera 5 years ago and had been wandering since then, unable to settle anywhere that reminded him too much of what he had lost. He spoke of his grief with quiet honesty, not seeking sympathy but simply sharing truth, and Sarah found herself telling him about her mother's death, about her father's slow decline, about the loneliness of being competent in a world that valued female competence far less than female compliance. The town watched their growing friendship with varying degrees of suspicion and disapproval, the church ladies making pointed comments about propriety and the need for proper chaperones, the men making cruder assessments about what must surely be happening behind closed doors regardless of what the legal papers claimed. Sarah tried to ignore the gossip, tried to follow Daniel's advice about not caring what critics thought, but years of seeking approval were not easily overcome, and she found herself constantly aware of watching eyes and whispered judgments. November arrived with the first hard frost, turning the world silver and brittle, and with it came a crisis that tested their partnership in ways neither had anticipated. A fire broke out in the building next to the mercantile, spreading with terrifying speed through the dry timber of structures built too close together with too little thought for safety. Sarah was alone in the store when she smelled smoke, her father already in bed upstairs, and terror seized her as she realized the danger they faced. She ran for the stairs, calling her father's name, hearing the crackling of flames and the shouts of men in the street organizing bucket brigades. The smoke was already thick, burning her throat and eyes, making it hard to see or breathe as she found her father confused and frightened in his bed, unable to understand the urgency or move quickly enough to escape the danger. She tried to lift him, to drag him toward the door, but he was too heavy and she was too small and panic was making her clumsy and ineffective. Then Daniel was there, appearing through the smoke like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak, his arms strong as he lifted her father with practiced ease, his voice calm as he told her to follow close, to stay low, to trust him to get them out safely. They made it to the street just as part of the roof collapsed, flames shooting skyward into the night, and Sarah watched with numb horror as the building that had housed her family's business for 2 generations burned despite the best efforts of the townspeople to contain the blaze. The mercantile survived. The fire stopped just short of consuming everything she had worked to save, but the smoke damage was extensive and several walls would need rebuilding. Her father, carried to safety but deeply shaken by the ordeal, retreated further into confusion, his lucidity fading as if the fire had burned away his last remaining connections to the present. Sarah stood in the street wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching smoke pour from her home and business, feeling Daniel's solid presence beside her and the weight of his hand on her shoulder, and she realized with crystal clarity that she would have lost everything without him, that his partnership had meant more than financial investment or commercial cooperation, that somewhere in the past month he had become essential to her survival in ways that transcended business arrangements. The rebuilding took 3 weeks, during which Sarah and her father stayed at the boarding house while Daniel coordinated repairs and supervised workers hired to restore what the fire had damaged. The town's attitude shifted slightly during this time, the visible evidence of Sarah's near-disaster softening even the hardest hearts, making it harder to maintain the fiction that she deserved her troubles for refusing proper marriage. The church ladies organized meals and donations, the men contributed labor to the rebuilding effort, and even Charles Thornton seemed to draw back from his campaign of economic harassment, perhaps recognizing that pushing too hard against someone who had just survived catastrophe would make him look petty and cruel rather than righteously wronged. Daniel worked himself nearly to exhaustion, sleeping little and driving the repairs forward with relentless focus, and Sarah found herself worrying about him in ways that had nothing to do with business partnership and everything to do with feelings she had tried hard not to develop. She brought him meals he barely touched, insisted he rest when he would have kept working through the night, found herself watching him with a tenderness that terrified her because it made her vulnerable in ways she had sworn never to allow. When the repairs were finally complete and they could move back into the mercantile, Sarah stood in the restored space feeling gratitude and grief tangled together so tightly she could not separate them. Gratitude for survival, for Daniel's help, for the town's unexpected support in crisis. Grief for her father's increasing absence even though his body still lived, for the innocence she had lost in learning just how precarious security really was, for the walls she had built around her heart that now seemed to be crumbling despite her best efforts to maintain them. "Thank you," she said to Daniel that first evening back, the words inadequate for everything she felt but the only ones she could trust herself to speak. "For saving my father, for managing the repairs, for staying when you could have moved on to somewhere less complicated." Daniel looked at her with those warm brown eyes that had become so familiar, so necessary, and she saw in them something that made her heart race and her breath catch. "I stayed because I wanted to," he said simply. "Because somewhere in the past 2 months, this stopped being just a business arrangement and became something more. I know we agreed to keep things professional, and I'll honor that agreement if that's what you need. But I want you to know that what I feel for you goes beyond partnership, beyond business, beyond anything I agreed to in those papers we signed." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, felt her carefully constructed defenses shatter completely under the weight of his honesty and her own longing for exactly what he was offering. "I feel it too," she whispered, the confession both liberation and terror. "I tried not to, tried to keep things simple and clear and safe, but somewhere between your first visit to this store and watching you carry my father through smoke and flames, I fell in love with you, and I don't know what to do with that." Daniel crossed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face with exquisite gentleness, his eyes searching hers for permission before he leaned down and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart sore. It was nothing like she had imagined kisses would be, nothing like the rough claiming she had feared from Charles Thornton, but rather a question asked and answered, a promise offered and accepted, a moment of perfect connection that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering lost. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt transformed, as if some essential piece of herself that had been missing had finally clicked into place. "What do we do now?" she asked, her practical nature reasserting itself even in the midst of overwhelming emotion. "The town already thinks poorly of our arrangement. If we pursue this, if we acknowledge these feelings, the gossip will only intensify." Daniel smiled, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek with infinite care. "Then maybe we give them something real to talk about," he said. "Maybe we stop pretending this is just business and acknowledge what it's actually become. Maybe we consider making this partnership permanent in every sense of the word." Sarah's heart stuttered at the implication, at the question hidden in his words, at the possibility that hung between them like a gift waiting to be accepted or rejected. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" she managed, her voice barely steady. "I'm asking if you would consider marrying me," Daniel said, no longer hiding behind implications or suggestions, but stating his desire with the same clear honesty he had brought to everything else. Not because of debts or duty or town expectations, but because I love you and I believe you love me, and I want to build a life with you that's based on partnership and respect and the kind of affection that makes hardship bearable and joy multiplied. It was everything Sarah had hoped for in those girlhood dreams she thought she had outgrown, everything her mother had wished for her in those final fever-bright days, everything she had believed impossible in a world that seemed designed to crush such hopes under the weight of practical necessity. And standing in her rebuilt mercantile with Daniel's hands still warm on her face and his eyes full of love and hope and gentle patience, she realized that sometimes Providence did show up exactly when needed, that sometimes strangers became saviors, that sometimes the bravest choice led not to disaster but to a happiness more profound than safety could ever provide. Sarah's answer came not in words, but in the way she leaned into Daniel's embrace, her arms wrapping around him with the desperate relief of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer willpower and could finally allow herself to be held, to be cherished, to trust that strength did not always mean standing alone. They stood like that for a long moment, the mercantile quiet around them except for the settling sounds of the rebuilt structure and the distant voices of townspeople going about their evening routines, and Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, some long-held tension finally releasing as she accepted that choosing love was not weakness but perhaps the greatest courage she had ever displayed. "Yes," she whispered against his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I have to, but because I want to, because you see me truly and value what you see, because partnership with you feels like freedom rather than captivity." Daniel's arms tightened around her, and she felt him release a breath he seemed to have been holding since he first asked the question that would change both their lives. "I promise you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me, that I will never take your strength for granted or mistake your competence for not needing care and tenderness, that we will build something together that honors both of us equally." They talked late into the night, making plans with the practical attention to detail that characterized both their natures, discussing how to announce their engagement, when to hold the wedding, how to structure their merged lives in ways that protected Sarah's hard-won independence while acknowledging the depth of their commitment. Sarah insisted on maintaining some separation in their business accounts, on retaining legal ownership of the mercantile that had been her family's legacy, and Daniel agreed without hesitation, understanding that her caution came from experience rather than distrust, that she needed these protections not because she doubted him but because she had learned the necessity of safeguarding what she had worked so hard to preserve. They decided to marry quickly, partly because extended engagement seemed pointless when they already knew their minds and hearts, partly because Sarah's father's declining health made delay feel dangerous, and partly because facing the town's judgment seemed easier to do as a married couple than as an unmarried pair whose relationship invited constant speculation and disapproval. The Reverend agreed to perform the ceremony in the church where Daniel had been working, and they set the date for 2 weeks hence, giving Sarah time to prepare but not so much time that doubt or fear could undermine the decision they had made. The announcement of their engagement sent fresh waves of gossip rippling through Miners Creek, the reactions ranging from genuine happiness for Sarah's unexpected fortune to cynical certainty that she had been compromised and marriage was simply making honest what had been happening in secret all along. The church ladies who had organized relief after the fire now clucked disapprovingly over the speed of the engagement, suggesting that proper mourning for Sarah's lost prospects with Charles Thornton should have been observed before rushing into arrangements with a comparative stranger. The men who had helped with rebuilding made crude jokes about carpenter's tools and measuring techniques, humor that made Sarah's cheeks burn when she overheard, but which Daniel weathered with patient good nature and the occasional quiet word that shut down the worst offenders without creating lasting enmity. Charles Thornton's reaction was the most concerning, his face turning white with rage when he heard the news, his hand crushing the hat he held until the brim was permanently misshapen. He made no public statements, but his actions spoke clearly enough, calling in every remaining debt he could claim against Sarah's business, refusing to extend credit to suppliers who continued dealing with her, making it known that anyone who attended her wedding would find their banking relationships suddenly under review. It was petty vindictiveness dressed in business practice, and while some merchants yielded to his pressure, others recognized it for what it was and quietly expressed their support for Sarah's choice even if they could not openly defy the man who controlled their access to capital. Sarah spent her final days as a single woman in a blur of activity, managing the mercantile during the day while preparing for marriage in whatever moments she could spare. There was no money for elaborate celebrations or fancy dresses, no time for the kind of drawn-out preparations that usually marked such occasions, but she found she did not mind the simplicity. She altered one of her mother's old dresses, the fabric still sound despite its age, the style modest but elegant, and as her needle moved through the cloth she felt connected to her mother in ways that brought both comfort and grief, imagining the approval that would have shone in those long-gone eyes. Her father had moments of clarity scattered among increasing confusion, and in one such moment Sarah told him about her upcoming marriage, watching anxiety and relief chase each other across his weathered face. "Daniel's a good man," he said, his speech slow but certain. "Your mother would approve." "I approve." "Don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let them make you doubt what your heart knows to be true." The night before her wedding, Sarah sat beside her father's bed long after he had fallen asleep, watching his chest rise and fall with the labored breathing that had become his constant companion, knowing with sad certainty that their time together was drawing to a close regardless of what medical care or devoted attention could provide. She thought about all the years they had worked together, all the lessons he had taught her about honest dealing and fair pricing and the importance of treating every customer with dignity regardless of their circumstances. She thought about his failures too, his inability to adapt when the market changed, his stubborn pride that had prevented him from asking for help until it was nearly too late, his retreat into confusion when reality became too painful to face directly. "I hope I'm making you proud, Papa," she whispered to his sleeping form. "I hope you understand that I'm choosing love but not abandoning practicality, that I'm taking a risk but not a foolish one, that Daniel represents both my heart's desire and my best hope for a future that honors everything you and Mama taught me about what marriage should be." Her father did not wake or respond, but Sarah felt peace settle over her like a benediction, a sense that she was indeed on the right path even if that path looked nothing like what she had once imagined or what the town had expected. She kissed his forehead gently and retired to her own room, sleeping better than she had in months, her dreams full of sunlight and open doors and the sensation of flying rather than falling, of rising rather than sinking beneath the weight of impossible expectations. The wedding day arrived with crystalline clarity, the November sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds, the air cold and sharp and invigorating. Sarah dressed in her mother's altered gown with trembling hands, her hair arranged simply but elegantly, her only jewelry the cameo brooch that had belonged to 3 generations of Mitchell women. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, someone who seemed to glow from within with hope and joy and the kind of beauty that had nothing to do with perfect features and everything to do with a heart finally free to feel what it had long suppressed. The church was half filled when she arrived, a smaller crowd than might have attended had her marriage been to Charles Thornton, but a more genuine gathering of those who actually wished her well rather than simply observing social obligation. Daniel stood at the altar looking nervous and handsome in his best suit, his eyes finding hers the moment she entered and holding her gaze with such love and promise that she felt tears threaten even before she began the walk down the aisle. The Reverend smiled at them both with warm approval, having witnessed enough forced marriages and unions of convenience to recognize genuine affection when he saw it, and his words during the ceremony spoke of partnership and mutual respect and the sacred duty of cherishing one another through all the seasons of life. When the moment came for Sarah to speak her vows, her voice rang clear and strong through the small church, each word a choice freely made rather than a surrender to necessity. "I, Sarah Mitchell, take you, Daniel Cooper, to be my husband, my partner, my friend, my love. I promise to honor your strength while offering my own, to build with you a life of shared purpose and mutual care, to face whatever comes with courage born of knowing I do not face it alone." Daniel's vows matched hers in sincerity and depth, his voice steady despite the emotion that shone in his eyes. "I, Daniel Cooper, take you, Sarah Mitchell, to be my wife, my partner, my inspiration, my heart. I promise to see you always as you truly are, to support your dreams while sharing my own, to create with you a home built on love and respect and the daily choice to cherish what we have found in each other." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and sweet, a promise of more intimate moments to come but restrained by the watching congregation and the sacred space where they stood. Yet even in its restraint there was profound connection, an acknowledgment of the journey that had brought them to this moment and the new journey beginning, and when they turned to face the assembled guests as husband and wife, Sarah felt she was seeing the world with new eyes, as if marriage had unlocked some perspective she had lacked before. The reception was simple, held in the church hall with food contributed by various townspeople and music provided by a fiddler who played reels and waltzes with enthusiastic imprecision. Sarah danced with Daniel, his hand warm and sure at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face, and she found herself laughing with pure joy for the first time in years, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity. They danced with others too, Daniel turning his attention to the elderly widows who glowed under his courtesy, Sarah partnering with young boys too shy to ask anyone else, both of them making sure that their celebration included and honored the community that had shown up to witness their union. Charles Thornton did not attend, which surprised no one, but his absence was noted less than Sarah had expected, as if the town had already moved on from the drama of refused proposals and accepted that her choice to marry the carpenter was made and final and not subject to further debate or judgment. There would always be those who whispered and speculated, who saw impropriety in the speed of their courtship or suggested that necessity rather than affection had driven their union, but Sarah found she cared less than she once would have, that Daniel's earlier words about letting talkers talk themselves hoarse while she was too busy thriving to care had become not just philosophy but practice. The weeks following their marriage settled into patterns that felt both new and natural, Daniel moving into the rooms above the mercantile and bringing with him a masculine presence that transformed the space from Sarah's solitary domain into a shared home. They navigated the intimate aspects of married life with patience and tenderness, Daniel understanding that trust came gradually even between married partners, Sarah learning to accept vulnerability as strength rather than weakness, both of them discovering that physical intimacy rooted in genuine affection was something entirely different from the dutiful obligations she had feared marriage would entail. Her father's health continued its slow decline, and Sarah found comfort in knowing he was surrounded by love in his final days, that Daniel treated him with respect and kindness, that the old man could slip away knowing his daughter was safe and cherished and would not face the future alone. When he finally passed on a cold December morning, his death was peaceful, his last lucid words a whispered blessing for Sarah and Daniel and the life they were building together. The grief was profound but clean, uncomplicated by regret or the kind of guilt that came from things left unsaid or undone. Sarah mourned her father while also feeling relief that his suffering had ended, that he had lived long enough to see her married and happy, that his final knowledge was of her security rather than her desperation. Daniel held her through the worst of her sorrow, his presence steady and comforting, never trying to fix what could not be fixed but simply being there, solid and sure, a reminder that love did not erase pain but made it bearable. The mercantile thrived under their joint management, Daniel's carpentry workshop bringing in customers who then browsed Sarah's merchandise, Sarah's business acumen helping Daniel price his work appropriately and market his skills effectively. They expanded gradually, adding services and products that met community needs, building a reputation for quality and fairness that attracted business from surrounding settlements. Within a year they had paid off the remaining debts completely. Within 2 they had savings enough to feel secure against emergency. Within 3 they were prosperous in ways that had nothing to do with extravagance and everything to do with solid foundations and careful growth. Their marriage deepened as time passed, the initial passion of new love evolving into something richer and more sustaining, a partnership that encompassed work and home and dreams for the future. They talked about everything, from inventory decisions to spiritual questions to the small observations about life that couples share when they truly know one another. They disagreed sometimes, their different perspectives creating friction that required navigation, but they had learned to argue fairly, to listen genuinely, to seek understanding rather than victory. Sarah discovered she was pregnant in their second spring together, the knowledge bringing joy tinged with fear of all the ways childbirth could go wrong, all the women who did not survive bringing life into the world. Daniel's protective instincts intensified immediately, his worry making him hover until Sarah had to gently remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time and she was strong enough to weather whatever came. Still, his concern touched her, his anxiety a measure of how much he valued her life, how completely she had become essential to his happiness. Their daughter was born in October with her mother's auburn hair and her father's brown eyes, a healthy squalling infant who brought sleepless nights and overwhelming love in equal measure. They named her Grace, for the unmerited favor that had brought them together, for the beauty that emerged from desperate circumstances, for the gentle strength that had characterized Sarah's mother and which they hoped would bless their daughter as well. Daniel proved a devoted father, comfortable with the messiness and demands of infant care in ways that surprised neighbors who expected men to remain distant from such female domains. The town's attitude toward Sarah and Daniel had gradually shifted from skeptical judgment to grudging acceptance to genuine respect as people witnessed the reality of their marriage and could not deny the evidence of genuine affection and successful partnership. Even Charles Thornton eventually moved on, marrying a widow from a neighboring settlement, his wounded pride healing enough to allow him cordial if not warm interactions when business brought them into contact. Sarah felt no satisfaction in his softening, no vindictive pleasure in having her choice validated, only relief that the worst of the community tension had eased and she could focus on building rather than defending. As their second anniversary approached, Sarah stood in the mercantile one evening after closing, Daniel working at his bench in the attached workshop. The sound of his plane smoothing with a comforting rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her daily life. Grace slept peacefully in a cradle Daniel had built with extraordinary care, every surface sanded smooth, every joint perfect, a work of love as much as craftsmanship. Sarah looked around at the well-stocked shelves, the tidy accounts, the evidence of prosperity earned through mutual effort, and she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from that desperate autumn when Charles Thornton had presented his ultimatum and she had believed she had no good choices. Daniel emerged from the workshop, wiping sawdust from his hands, and came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist with the easy familiarity of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, reading her contemplative mood with the insight of someone who knew her deeply. "About choices," Sarah said, leaning into his warmth. "About how the hardest decision I ever made turned out to be the best one, how refusing what everyone expected opened the door to something I never imagined possible. About how close I came to saying yes to Charles Thornton out of fear and duty, and how different my life would be now if I had chosen safety over hope." Daniel kissed the top of her head, his gesture tender and understanding. "You were brave," he said simply. "Braver than you knew, braver than anyone gave you credit for. You chose what was right for you even when everyone else was telling you it was wrong, and that kind of courage deserves to be celebrated." "We were both brave," Sarah corrected, turning in his arms to face him, her hands resting against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat strong and steady. "You were brave to offer partnership to a desperate stranger, brave to invest your savings in an uncertain venture, brave to love a woman who was so afraid of vulnerability that she almost pushed you away." They stood together in the quiet mercantile, their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, the evening sun casting golden light through the windows, and Sarah felt a contentment so profound it bordered on holy. This was what her mother had wanted for her, what she had hoped for herself in those girlhood dreams before life had taught her to settle for less. This was partnership built on mutual respect, love born of genuine knowing, security rooted in shared effort rather than dependent obligation. "I'm grateful," Sarah whispered, the words inadequate for the fullness of what she felt but the best she could offer. "Grateful for your kindness that first day you walked into my store, grateful for your patience while I learned to trust, grateful for every morning I wake up beside you and every evening we share after the work is done. Grateful that I was brave enough to refuse what was expected and choose what was real." Daniel's response was a kiss, deep and sweet, a wordless affirmation that needed no elaboration. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, he said what he said every night before they climbed the stairs to their private rooms, the words a ritual that never lost their power through repetition. "I love you, Sarah Cooper. Today and always." "I love you, Daniel Cooper," she replied, her heart full. "Today and always." The years that followed brought the usual mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, the ordinary struggles and celebrations that marked any life lived fully and honestly. They had 2 more children, sons who inherited their father's skill with wood and their mother's head for numbers. The mercantile continued to prosper, expanding twice to accommodate growing inventory and Daniel's increasingly sophisticated carpentry projects. They weathered economic downturns and personal setbacks, illness and injury and the inevitable losses that time brought, but they weathered them together, their partnership proving as strong in adversity as in prosperity. Sarah never forgot the desperate autumn when she stood at a crossroads between obligation and desire, between safety and risk, between a marriage that would have destroyed her spirit and a refusal that opened the door to unexpected grace. She thought of it often when she counseled young women facing their own difficult choices, when she spoke at church gatherings about trusting inner wisdom even when outer voices claimed certainty, when she held her daughter's hand and told her stories about courage coming in many forms but always requiring a willingness to choose authenticity over approval. The lesson she had learned, the wisdom purchased at such high cost and rewarded with such rich blessing, was this: that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was say no to what everyone expected, that real security came not from avoiding risk but from building something genuine with someone worthy of trust, that love freely chosen was worth more than any amount of coerced compliance could ever provide. She had been forced by circumstance to choose between a banker's calculated proposal and a drifter's uncertain promise, and in choosing the drifter she had found not just a husband but a true partner, not just security but joy, not just survival but a life worth living. As Sarah grew older, her auburn hair turning silver, her capable hands marked by years of work but still strong, she looked back on her life with satisfaction and forward to whatever time remained with hope. She had built something true, something that honored both her parents' legacy and her own hard-won wisdom, something that would outlast her in the children and grandchildren, who carried forward the lessons she had learned about courage and love and the importance of choosing well even when choosing was terrifying. And if sometimes young women came to her mercantile, their eyes shadowed with a kind of desperation she remembered all too well, seeking not just goods but wisdom about impossible choices and narrowing options, Sarah welcomed them warmly and shared her story without embellishment or false comfort. She told them the truth, that choosing authentically was not easy, that standing against expectation required courage that felt impossible until the moment it became necessary, that love was worth waiting for and worth fighting for and worth the risk of temporary hardship in pursuit of lasting joy. "Don't let anyone force you into a life that isn't yours," she would tell them, her green eyes still sharp despite her age, her voice still strong despite the years. "Don't marry for duty or fear or because everyone says you should be grateful for whatever offer comes your way. Wait for partnership, for respect, for the kind of love that sees you clearly and cherishes what it sees. It may come in unexpected forms, from unexpected people, at unexpected times. But it will come, if you're brave enough to refuse what's wrong while remaining open to what's right." Her story spread beyond Miners Creek, becoming something of a legend, the tale of the woman who refused the banker and chose the drifter, who gambled everything on love and won not just romance but genuine partnership, who proved that courage and wisdom could coexist, that choosing well required both head and heart working in harmony. It inspired some and puzzled others, was told with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment, but its core message remained constant: that women deserved more than mere survival, that true security came from genuine partnership rather than obligated dependence, that the hardest choices sometimes led to the richest rewards. And so Sarah Mitchell Cooper lived a full life, rich in love and purpose and the deep satisfaction that came from building something true with someone worthy. She had been forced by circumstance to choose between expectation and authenticity, had been brave enough to choose authentically, and had discovered that sometimes Providence showed up disguised as a dusty carpenter with kind eyes and a generous heart, offering not rescue but partnership, not safety but the chance to build something genuine together. When Sarah finally passed in her 80s, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her final words were for Daniel, who had grown old beside her, their hands still finding each other across any space, their love still evident in every glance and gesture. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice faint but clear, "for seeing me truly, for loving me well, for building this beautiful life with me. I would choose you again, every time, in every circumstance." Daniel held her hand as she slipped away, his tears flowing freely, his grief profound but tempered by gratitude for the decades they had shared, for the life they had built, for the love that had transformed two lonely strangers into a partnership that had blessed not just themselves but everyone their lives had touched. And in his grief he found comfort in knowing that their story would continue, that their children carried forward the lessons they had learned and lived, that somewhere a young woman facing impossible choices might hear their tale and find courage to choose authentically, to wait for genuine love, to believe that sometimes the hardest decisions led to the most beautiful outcomes. Their story became part of Miners Creek's history, told and retold through generations, adapted and expanded but never losing its essential truth. That Sarah Mitchell had been forced by the town to marry the banker, had chosen the drifter instead, and in that choice had found not just survival but joy, not just security but love, not just a husband but a true partner who had walked beside her through every season of life, sharing burdens and multiplying blessings until the very end. And perhaps that is what we all seek, whether we live in small frontier towns or modern cities, whether we face forced marriages or different forms of pressure to settle for less than we deserve. The courage to choose authentically, the wisdom to recognize genuine partnership when it appears, and the faith that choosing well, even at great cost, leads ultimately to the kind of life that makes every sacrifice worthwhile. Sarah's story reminds us that we are not powerless even when circumstances seem to leave us no good options, that unexpected help often comes from unexpected sources, that love freely chosen is worth waiting for and fighting for and building a life around. So if you find yourself at a crossroads, facing pressure to accept what everyone says you should be grateful for, remember Sarah Mitchell and her choice. Remember that courage looks like saying no to what's wrong even before you can clearly see what's right. Remember that sometimes the greatest adventure begins with a refusal rather than an acceptance. Choose authentically. Choose bravely. Choose love over obligation, partnership over dependence, hope over resignation. And trust that somewhere out there, your Daniel Cooper is looking for you too, carrying his own tools and his own story, ready to build something beautiful together if you're brave enough to choose him when he finally appears. What's your story of choosing bravely? Have you ever had to refuse what everyone expected in favor of what your heart knew was right? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about courage, love, and the transformative power of choosing authentically. Your story matters. Your choices matter, and sometimes sharing them helps others find courage for their own difficult decisions.